Hi, everybody. Welcome to another lecture. We're still talking about the general topic of social influence, where we're looking at how our behaviors, our attitudes are influenced by other people. And so far, we've looked at conformity, we've looked at persuasion. Now we're going to talk about a third type of social influence, which is known as compliance. And we're going to ratchet up the pressure a little bit. So last class, when we talked about persuasion, we were talking about people's attempts to change our attitudes like via commercials and things like that. When we talk about compliance, what we're talking about are his behavior change in response to a direct request. So whereas when we talk about persuasion, we're talking about, for instance, advertisements, which are trying to change your attitudes, but are not necessarily making a direct request of you. When we're talking about compliance, we are, where people are directly requesting that you do something. Now, the one of the themes that underscores a lot of this work, which we also saw before in the lecture on persuasion, is that of mindlessness. In other words, that we often behave without a lot of careful thought. This is one of the general themes of social psychology in general. We've seen this pop up in the past. This is one reason why people rely on heuristics, for example. Um, and it's going to pop up again in the future. And this tendency that we have to often behave mindlessly means that people who know that can take advantage of us and they can get us to change our behaviors in way that they want by using various strategies and tactics on us. Now, the researcher that's most associated with the topic of compliance, his name is Robert Cialdini. He actually went undercover as a car salesman for, I think, 2 years in order to investigate the various tactics and strategies that used car salesmen used to try to sell cars to their customers. And on the basis of that work that he did, he uncovered what he calls 6 compliance principles. These are those 6 principles that he uncovered. We're going to talk about each one of these in turn. And we're going to see that for each principle, there are certain tactics that people will often use to try to convince you to do something. And I think it's really important that you understand what these principles are and what the corresponding tactics are, because the people who try to manipulate you, they often know. They often have very sneaky ways of tricking you into doing something. And it seems only fair to me that you should be aware of these tactics and of these strategies that they're using to try to manipulate you. So let's start with number 1, reciprocity. Reciprocity is the general tendency that exists within this culture that we should treat others as they treat us. So, for example, if someone does us a favor, the norm of reciprocity that exists says that we owe them a favor back, right? If someone buys us a Pepsi, then we owe them money for that, or we have to buy them one later on, right? This doesn't necessarily exist as strongly for friends or family members, but at least for acquaintances or strangers, this norm of reciprocity tends to exist, that we should treat others as they treat us. And there's good reasons for this. We don't want people taking advantage of others. So it makes sense that if someone does us a favor, you should feel a need to maybe return the favor or something along those lines. Just to show this tendency, how strong this tendency is to want to reciprocate something. Some researchers did a very simple study where they took a bunch of Christmas cards and they wrote something like Merry Christmas from Bob and Sue. And then they sent them to random people that they picked out of a phone book that they had never met before. Okay, there were 578 people they picked out of a phone book, and they sent each of these people a card, a Christmas card. Now, they put their return address on the envelope. So what they were interested in is whether these people, when they got this Christmas card, whether they would return the favor by sending a Christmas card back. And in fact, about 117 of them did, about 20% or so. Why did they do this? They didn't know these people, right? But because we have this tendency to want to reciprocate a favor, if someone sends us a Christmas card, even though we don't recognize who these people are, we often feel a need to return the favor by sending them a Christmas card. And of those 117, almost no one said they didn't know who the people were that sent them the card in the first place. It's just sort of this automatic reaction they have. They did us a favor, we owe them a favor. Now, that's all fine and good. But the problem is that people who want to manipulate you can take advantage of the fact that you feel this need to reciprocate favors by making it seem as if they've done you a favor, which you then feel a need to reciprocate. And there's a couple of different techniques that are based on this idea. So one technique is known as the door in the face technique. This is a 2-step process that people can use. In the first step, someone makes a really large request and they get turned down from that request. So, for example, maybe you are driving and you get to an intersection and someone comes up to your car and they're trying to raise money for some cause and they ask you, can you donate $100 to this cause? Now they know that no one's really going to give them $100 like a stranger, right? So they're going to get turned down almost inevitably. But what happens is that once they get turned down, they follow it up with a smaller, more reasonable request. Okay, so you don't want to donate $100? Well, any amount of money will do, even a dollar will help. Now, this is really the request they were after in the first place. But if they had just asked you straight out for a dollar, you might have said no. But if they make this really large request, can I have $100? And you say no, and then they ask for only a dollar, you become much more likely to agree to that smaller request. Why is that the case? Because it feels as if this person, this requester, did us a favor. They wanted $100. They're willing to settle for only $1. It feels like they're doing us a favor by asking us for a lot less, right? And because it feels like they're doing us a favor, they're making a concession, in other words, we feel a need to return that concession by, for example, donating that money. And note that this technique also has sort of a bonus aspect to it, because although the requester doesn't expect the person to agree to that first large request, if they do, it's just a bonus, right? They may not expect anyone to agree to pay $100, but maybe every once in a while someone will agree to it and they've just made a lot more money, right? So they can't really go wrong with this strategy in a sense. So let me give you an example, an empirical example of a test of this. And so let me move this out of the way. So in this research, some researchers approached people and they asked them in the control, they randomly assigned people to one of two conditions, a control group and an experimental group. And people in the control group were asked the following question: would you be willing to serve as unpaid chaperones for juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo? People in the experimental condition, on the other hand, were first asked the following question: would you be willing to serve as unpaid counselors to juvenile delinquents for 2 hours a week for 2 years? So in other words, would you be willing to give up about 200 hours of your time unpaid to serve as counselors? Now, everyone says no to this, right? It's kind of a ridiculously large request. So everyone says no to this. And once they say no, they're then asked, well, okay, would you be willing to serve as unpaid chaperones for juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo? And so what the researchers are looking at is how many people would agree to the second request, or in the case of the control group, the only request that was made. And that's what's being demonstrated here. So if you look at the control condition, when people weren't first asked if they would be unpaid counselors for 2 years, if they were just asked, would you take these kids to the zoo? You only get about, what is that, about 17% of people agreeing, about 1 in 6 people say yes. But if you first ask them if they'd be willing to serve as unpaid counselors for 200 hours, and only then ask them if they'd be willing to take this day trip to the zoo, that number skyrockets to like 50%. It roughly tripled the likelihood that people would agree to take juvenile delinquents to the zoo just because they had been first asked this really, really large request, which everyone turned down. Because again, it makes these people feel like, well, you wanted me for 200 hours and I said no, and now you're only asking me for a couple hours of my time. Well, okay, you're doing me a favor, so I'm going to return the favor by agreeing. Calvin says, Mom, can I set fire to my bed mattress? No, Calvin. Can I ride my tricycle on the roof? No, Calvin. Then can I have a cookie? But his mom took social psychology, so she's on to him and says, no, Calvin. Um, but of course, when Calvin is asking these questions, when he's asking if he can set fire to his bed mattress or ride his tricycle on the roof, he knows his mother's not going to say yes. That's not why he's asking. He's only asking because he's making these really, really large requests. So when she says no to them and he follows it up with the request he really wanted, can I have a cookie? She becomes more likely to agree to it because she's turned down those larger requests already. So Calvin's basically using the door in the face technique right now. And we see examples of the general reciprocity principle in action and the more specific door in the face technique in a couple of different contexts. I'll give you a few examples. One of the chores that I really hate is going grocery shopping. I find it kind of boring, but the best part of going grocery shopping is when they have free samples, right? But you can't go right to the free samples. You have to pretend like you're walking by and then they catch your eye. Oh, a free sample. And you kind of go over there. Um, and what'll happen is that once you get that free sample, maybe the person who gave you that free sample says, maybe it's a cracker or something, says, well, we have a box of these crackers here. You could buy it right now. And if you're like most people, you don't really want to buy the box of crackers. You just wanted the free sample, right? And you could just say, no, thank you, and walk on. But if you're like me, what you do is you feel this need to make an excuse. Oh, those dudes look at me. I'll think about it. I'll come back around. I'll let you know if I want it later, right? And you make all these excuses. But why do we feel the need to do that? This person doesn't care if you buy the crackers. This person's not earning a commission if you buy the crackers. Why do we feel bad and feel this need to make an excuse to not buy these crackers? Well, it's because it feels like they did you a favor. They gave you a free sample of something that they did you a favor, and you feel a need to return that favor. It feels awkward just to have someone do something for us and us to not return it, which is why we feel this need to make an excuse. This is largely why, to some degree, why grocery stores and other places give out free samples. It's not only to expose you to the product, although that's part of it, but also because they know that by giving you a small free sample, you're more likely to make a larger purchase of that actual item because you feel a need to return that favor. So that works off this principle of reciprocity. Or if you take a look at the show The Family Guy, this was created by Seth MacFarlane. In the commentary in one of the early seasons, he talks about how he gets certain jokes into the show. Because there's certain jokes he wants to put into the show that he knows the censors, the network censors, are not going to allow him to put in the show. And so when he's writing an episode and he has this joke he wants to get into the show, what he'll do is he'll often write these really outrageous jokes, okay, that he knows the censors will never allow him to get in the show. But he deliberately puts them in those episodes. So that way, when the censors come back and say, no, you can't put these jokes in the episode, what Seth MacFarlane does is says, well, okay, I'll tell you what. Well, if I take out this joke and this joke and this joke, can I at least have this last joke in there? But that last joke's only the one that's the only one he really wanted in the first place, right? And so the censors, though, because it feels as if Seth MacFarlane is doing them a favor, he's agreeing to drop these three jokes. They become much more likely to agree to allow him to get the joke in that he really wanted in the first place. So what he's doing is he's effectively using the door in the face technique. He's making these really large requests and then dropping the magnitude of that request. In fact, we even see this, the door in the face technique, if we look at the Watergate scandal. I would argue, in fact, that the door in the face technique led to the downfall of one of the most powerful people in the world, Richard Nixon, which led to his resignation. So here's the basic idea. When Nixon was running for re-election, a number of people who were working for him broke into the Democratic National offices at the Watergate Hotel and they bugged them. Okay. This was quickly uncovered, and there was an increasing cover up and people in the Nixon administration who kept denying that they were involved, but it became increasingly clear that they were actually involved. And ultimately, it led to Nixon resigning the office in disgrace. That's kind of the common Watergate story that a lot of people know. What a lot of people don't know as well is just how dumb this idea to bug the Watergate Hotel actually was. Because it turns out that Nixon was almost surely going to win re-election anyways. They didn't need to do any of this stuff. So the only way he wasn't going to win re-election is if they did something really stupid and messed up. And so there was really no need to bug these offices. So how did they become bugged? Well, what happened is this. In fact, people who were on this committee, by the way, people who were working for him, who ended up bugging these offices, themselves later said, "How could we have been so stupid as to actually do this? Like, how could we have thought this was a good idea?" Well, let me tell you. Here's how. What happened was this. There was a guy by the name of G. Gordon Liddy, and he goes to this committee working for the president, and he says, "Look, guys, I have a great idea. For the cost of $2 million, what I can do, I have this whole plan. It involves sabotage and wiretapping, and there's kidnapping, and we're going to get this yacht, and we're going to put escorts on the yacht. We're going to frame the Democrats. We're going to Democrats on it. We're going to frame them, and there's going to be spy planes, and we're going to bug the offices of the Watergate Hotel. We're going to do all this for $2 million." And the committee looked at him and said, "That's crazy. That's ridiculous. We're never doing that." So he leaves and he comes back and he says, "Okay, I'll tell you what. For $1 million, let's get rid of the spy planes. Let's get rid of the kidnapping and the mugging stuff. But I still want to keep the sabotage. I still want to have this yacht with these escorts. We can frame the Democrats. I still want to bug the Watergate Hotel." And again, the committee looks at him and says, "That's crazy. We're not doing that." So he comes back a third time and says, "Okay, final offer. For only $500,000, I'll get rid of everything except for bugging the offices in the Watergate Hotel. Give me $500,000. That's what I'll do." And the committee looked at him and said yes. And that's how Watergate happened. What happened there was effectively the door in the face technique. G. Gordon Liddy had asked for $2 million to do this just incredibly complicated plan. And when he got turned down, he reduces the magnitude of that request and makes a smaller request, at which point the committee agreed. That should sound an awful lot like the door in the face technique. In fact, if you look at quotes from the committee members, you can see the door in the face technique in action. One of the committee members said this, after starting at the grandiose sum of $1 million, and sorry, he started at 1 million, reduced the offer to $500,000, and then to $250,000. I got the numbers wrong, but after starting at the grandiose sum of $1 million, we thought that probably 250,000 would be an acceptable figure. We were reluctant to send him away with nothing. Okay. Why were they reluctant to send him away with nothing? Because it felt like he was doing them a favor, and they felt this need to return the favor by greenlighting this plan. Or take this quote. If he had come to us at the outset, said, I have a plan to burglarize and wiretap Larry O'Brien's office, it's a Democrat, we might have rejected the idea out of hand. Instead, he came to us with his elaborate call girl, kidnapping, mugging, sabotage, wiretapping scheme. He had asked for the whole loaf when he was quite content to settle for half or even a quarter. This is a perfect summary of the door in the face technique, right? If he had come to us outright and said, I want $250,000 to bug the offices, we would have said no. But he came to us with this large request. And then when he dropped the magnitude of that request, that made us more likely to agree to it. That's basically the door in the face technique in the nutshell. That's how not having an appropriate understanding of social psychology led to the downfall of the most powerful man in the world. So that was all the norm of reciprocity. A second principle related to compliance is the principle of what's known as commitment and consistency, which is very much related to something we've seen before in this course. Because when we looked, or I'll get there in 1 second, what this principle says is that when we make a commitment to something, we commit ourselves to a course of action, we feel pressure, we feel this need to behave consistently with that past commitment, which should sound very familiar because that sounded a lot like cognitive dissonance. In other words, if we make a commitment to something and we don't behave consistently, we will tend to experience cognitive dissonance. We don't want that feeling. And so as a consequence, we feel this need to behave consistently with our past commitments. That makes sense from a psychological point of view. We don't want to be hypocrites, for example. But what it means is that people who try to manipulate you can get you to make commitments or get you to think you're making commitments that you wouldn't have made otherwise, under the idea that you're going to behave consistently with those commitments. Give you some examples. This is a very simple study. A researcher went to the beach and they found someone who was lying by themselves on a towel. Okay. This is going to be their unwitting participant. And what the researcher did is they went beside this person and they laid out their own towel and they sat down, they pulled out like a radio, they turned the radio on, and they're just kind of relaxing on their towel. After a few minutes, this person gets up and at that point randomly assigns this participant who doesn't know their participant, but this person beside them, they get randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In the control condition, the researcher simply walks off. In the experimental condition, the researcher first turns to this person and says, excuse me, could you please watch my things while I'm gone? Now, you've likely been in that situation where maybe someone's come up to you like in a coffee shop and says like, hey, can you watch my stuff while I'm in the bathroom? You know, when people do this, we say, yeah, sure, no big deal. We like always agree to this request, right? So what happened is that everybody agreed, yes, I'll watch your things. Well, what happens later is like 5 minutes later, there's another guy. He's walking down the beach and he sees this towel with the radio on it. And he looks around and he grabs the radio and he takes off. Now, this is someone working with the experimenter, of course. But what they want to know is whether this person, this unwitting participant, are they going to chase after the radio thief or not? And that's what's being displayed here. The percentage of people who intervene by chasing after the radio thief. So if you look at people first off in the control condition, only about 20% of them actually did anything. The vast majority of people just watched this guy run off with the radio. Only 20% intervened. But if you look at the people in the condition who were first asked, will you please watch my things? And they sort of mindlessly just said, yeah, sure, no problem. Suddenly, 95% of people intervened. 95% of people started to go after this radio thief. One person actually caught them and tackled them into the sand, turns out. This is a huge difference between 20% and 95%. And it all came about because people agreed mindlessly to, yes, I'll watch your things. But once they committed to that point of view that I will watch your things, they felt a need to behave consistently with that commitment and chase after the thief. In fact, telephone solicitors who will call people randomly and try to get them to donate money, for instance, to some cause, they have very, very subtle techniques oftentimes to get people to comply with their requests. So one thing they do is this: they'll call someone up. Oh, and they answer, they say, "Hi, Mr. and Mrs. Weber, how are you today?" You say, obviously I'm fine. They've already got you. They've already got you at that point. Because what happens is this: when they ask you how you're doing, even if you're not doing well, you're not going to start complaining to a telemarketer that your elbow's been bothering you recently or whatever, right? We mindlessly have this automatic response. How are you doing? I'm fine. How are you? Right? So what happens is that once you say I'm fine, they follow it up by saying, well, that's great to hear that you're doing so well because some other people are not doing as well as you and they need your help. Now, this creates an awkward situation because you did voluntarily say you're doing fine, right? Even though it's a mindless response, you voluntarily said that. And if you're doing fine, how could you not afford to donate a little bit of money to people who are not doing fine? And what research has shown is simply asking people how they're doing and getting them to respond they're fine makes them more likely to then donate money than if you didn't ask them how they're doing in the first place, because of the principle of commitment and consistency. This one I think is kind of genius. Um, Toy marketers had a problem, which is that they would sell a lot of toys in the days, weeks, months leading up to Christmas, because parents are obviously buying their kids presents. But there would be a lull for the month or two after Christmas. So the parents have just bought presents for their kids. They're not going to go out, on December 28th and buy more presents for their kids. They already did that. So they were trying to figure out, how do we increase sales in the month after Christmas? And they came up with kind of an ingenious strategy. What they did is this: they would have a toy and they'd create a lot of buzz about this toy such that all these kids wanted the toy, right? And then what they would do is they would deliberately understock it at their stores, which sounds counterintuitive. Why would you not stock a toy that everyone wants to buy? Well, what happens is that after Christmas, by some miracle, suddenly this toy starts flooding into these toy stores. Okay? This has happened multiple times. This has happened with Tickle Me Elmos and Furbies and Beanie Babies and Cabbage Patch Kids going all the way back to the 80s, where there's just this huge demand for some toy, and no one can find this toy anywhere. It's just like out of stock everywhere. But here's why it works. What happens is that maybe a kid sees an ad for a Tickle Me Elmo, and the kid says, "Mom, can you buy me a Tickle Me Elmo?" And the mom says, "Sure, if you're good, I'll buy you a Tickle Me Elmo for Christmas." And then she goes to the store to buy the Tickle Me Elmo before Christmas. She can't find it anywhere. In fact, they're not going to get a shipment in until after Christmas, but she can't get her kid nothing. So she buys a substitute toy for the kid. Then after Christmas, on December 26th or 27th or 28th, the shipment of toys comes in. And she's already promised her kid this toy. So to live up to her own commitment, to the commitment she made to her kid, she goes back to the store, buys a Tickle Me Elmo for her kid. That way, these toy stores are kind of like selling people two toys before, when they would only sell one. They sell the toy before Christmas and the toy the kid really wanted after Christmas. And it all works because people feel a need to behave consistently with a commitment, even a commitment they made to their kid, that they would buy them that toy. So we see examples of commitment and consistency all the time. There is also a specific technique based on the principle of commitment and consistency, known as the foot in the door technique. This is not to be confused with the door in the face technique. People sometimes get those confused. The foot in the door technique is basically the opposite of the door in the face technique. So what happens is that the person making a request, they get someone to comply, to agree to a small request. Once they've agreed to the small request, they increase the magnitude of that request. And what happens is that as long as that second larger request is conceptually related to the first request, people become more likely to agree with it if they've already agreed to a smaller request. Let me describe a study and I'll explain why that happens. This is the Drive Carefully study. So what researchers did is they went to houses in a neighborhood and they would knock on the door, and when someone answered, they'd say, "Hi, we're from the, highway safety company," or something like that. And we have this billboard. We're trying to promote safe driving. We've got this billboard. We're asking people if they'd be willing to put this billboard in their front lawn. And you take a look at the billboard, and it's this giant thing with really gaudy, ugly colors, and it just says "Drive carefully," just splashed all over this billboard, right? It's this really ugly eyesore. Now, what some of these people don't know is that half of them, about a week or two earlier, had been approached by someone else that was going door to door, different person, but we're asking them to put these like 2 inch by 2 inch stickers in their window that says something like "Drive carefully." Now, 2 weeks ago, everyone who had been asked that had agreed to do that because that's not a big request. It's just a small request, right? So fast forward 2 weeks. So these people who were asked to put this "Drive carefully" billboard in the front lawn, some of them had earlier agreed to a small request, and some of them had not been approached by someone. And the researchers want to know, well, people who had already agreed to put this sticker in their window, are they now more likely to agree to put this giant, ugly billboard in their front lawn? And these are those data. So if you look at the control condition, the people who had not agreed to put this sticker in their window, they'd never been approached by anyone asking them to do that. Okay. So they were just approached and asked to put this billboard in their front lawn. You get only about like 18% of people who agreed to do that. But if you look at people who had earlier agreed to put the sticker in their window that said like "Drive safely," suddenly that number jumps from 18% to about 76%. It about roughly quadrupled. That's a huge effect, huge effect. But why does it happen? Why does agreeing to put a sticker in your window make you more likely a week later to put this giant billboard in your front lawn? Well, what happened is this: when these people put the sticker in their window, that changes their self-concept. This sticker is pro-safe driving. I agree to put that in the window. That means I am pro-safe driving. That's part of my self-concept. So when a week later someone comes along and says, "Would you put this "Drive carefully" billboard in your front lawn?" Well, that's consistent with your new self-concept that you're pro-safe driving. This is an example of you being pro-safe driving again. So because it's part of your new self-concept, you agree to it, right? This is why the initial request has to be conceptually related to the later request, okay? Because what people do is they think, well, this new request is related to that smaller request I made, which is now part of my self-concept, so I feel a need to agree to it. So that's one technique, the foot in the door technique, that relies on the principle of commitment and consistency. A second technique that relies on the same principle, but it's a different technique, is something known as lowballing. This is kind of a shady technique. It's also a two-step process. What happens with lowballing is this, that if I'm the requester, I get someone to agree to some request that I'm making of them. And once they agree, and only once they agree, do I then reveal certain hidden costs. So you can see this in a number of contexts. So for example, let's say that someone's buying a car and I'm a car salesman, right? And so let's say that they've agreed to buy the car at $20,000, let's just say. Okay. So I get them to agree, they agree, okay, I'm going to buy this car, $20,000, shake hands. Then when they go to sign the paperwork, I reveal the fact that, well, okay, there's taxes on top of that, there's a title fee, and there's all these other sort of fees. So it's actually $25,000. Now, I didn't tell them that up front. I only revealed those extra costs after they've agreed to buy the car at $20,000. But what happens is because people have agreed to buy the car at 20,000, that makes them more likely to agree to those hidden costs. Whereas if I had just approached someone and said, "Would you buy this car for 25,000?" they're much more likely to say no to it. But if they agree to 20,000 and then I only reveal the extra 5,000 later, they become more likely to agree to it. That's partly because once this person has agreed to buy the car, it's there in their mind. That's all they can think about. They're already picturing themselves in this new car, right? It's theirs as far as they're concerned. And suddenly there's this new obstacle in the way. There's an extra few $1,000s they need to spend. But because in their mind they've already bought the car, they don't want to turn down that opportunity just for a few extra thousands, so they're more likely to pay it. So that's one example where you see this. But there's other examples as well. When you buy stuff online, lots of online companies do this. Ticketmaster does this a lot. Or what will happen is that you'll see concert tickets for, let's say, $50. And you say, fantastic, I would love to see this band for $50. So you buy them. Then when you get to the checkout portion, it's no longer $50. It's like $85 because they've added on taxes and a convenience fee and all these other sorts of fees. They didn't tell you about those fees ahead of time. They just said the ticket price is $50. But it's only once you've gone through the process of like putting your address in, your billing address and your shipping address and filling out all these forms, and only when you get to the final page does it reveal those hidden costs. And it does that because they know that if you go through the effort of filling out all these forms and filling in your shipping address and billing address, when you get to that last page and the only thing stopping you from actually getting those tickets that are in your mind are yours is an extra $35, you're going to tend to buy those tickets anyway. So you're more likely to buy them than if I had said they're $85 up front. This has also been looked at experimentally. So what researchers did is they randomly assigned participants to one of two conditions. So what they did is they called students in a class, like in a social psychology class like this one, and they said, look, I know that your professor is offering you extra credit to do some studies. We've got a study that we're running people in. Um, would you be willing to participate in the study? And if people said yes, the researcher then said, great, the study is actually this Saturday at 7 a.m. That's the experimental condition. In the control condition, they would call people from the class and say, hey, I hear you're in a class. You can do extra credit by participating in studies. We have a study this Saturday at 7 a.m. Would you be willing to participate? So in other words, half the people were told the studies at 7 a.m. on Saturday up front, and the other half were only told after people agreed to participate in that study. And then the researchers, they actually showed up to the location 7 a.m. on Saturday to see if the participants would show up. And what they showed is that people who were lowballed, people who agreed to participate and were only then told the studies at 7 a.m. on Saturday, they were more likely to show up. They still showed up, whereas people were not likely to agree to that request if they were told right up front that the study was at 7 a.m. People, because they had already committed themselves to participating in the study, they felt a need to then be consistent with that commitment by agreeing to the study even after it was revealed that it started at 7 a.m. on Saturday. Third principle is the principle of social proof. Social proof says this, that we view a behavior as correct to the extent that we see other people performing it. This is one of the general themes of social psychology, is that when we don't know what the correct behavior is in a given situation, the first thing we do is we look to other people to see how they're behaving. And if everyone's doing the same thing, we view that behavior as the correct behavior to engage in. In fact, this sounds pretty similar to what we've talked about before in this class of conformity, right? It's very similar to conformity. When we talked about conformity, we talked about one of the reasons why people conform is due to informational influence, because we believe that other people know something that we don't. They're engaging in the correct behavior, and so we conform because we think they're correct. And that's exactly what's happening here, that if we see other people performing a behavior, we view that as the correct behavior and we follow along. Now, sometimes this is accurate. Sometimes other people have information that we don't, and they know what to do and we don't, and following along might be a good idea. But it also means that we're susceptible to falling prey to fake social proof. Because people that try to manipulate you can make it appear as if everyone's doing something, even if they're not, to convince you that you should be doing that thing as well. In other words, they can create false social proof. For example, if you think about sitcoms that have a laugh track, okay? I've always hated sitcoms that have a laugh track because like two people might be in an apartment having a conversation and someone makes a joke and suddenly 50 people are laughing off screen. Like where are those 50 people? They're not in the apartment. It sort of breaks the realism of the show to have like these random people laughing, right? So why is it that shows rely on laugh tracks? Well, one of the reasons is because shows seem funnier when you hear other people laughing at them. You can test this for yourself. There are certain shows, I think they do this with the Big Bang Theory. There might be some other ones as well. You can go to YouTube and type in something like Big Bang Theory with no laugh track, and it'll show you a scene from the show where they've removed the laugh track, and it's very awkward, and it does not really seem funny. Um, and you can tell that when you remove the laughter, the jokes don't hit like they do when the laughter is there. And that's because of the principle of social proof. When we hear other people laughing, that tells us, hey, this is a joke. This is funny. You should laugh at this. And people actually find shows funnier when there's a laugh track versus when there's not a laugh track for those shows in general. If you work in the service industry and you work for tips, I can give you a tip about tips based on the principle of social proof. So let's say, for instance, you're a bartender and you've got a tip jar, right? One of the best things you can do is before your shift starts, put a few dollars of your own money in your tip jar. Because what happens is this: if I'm a customer and I come up to you as a bartender and I ask you for a drink and you give me a drink, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, should I tip? And I look at the tip jar and there's no money in there. I say to myself, well, no one else is tipping. I guess I don't need to either. So I don't tip. But if I look at the tip jar and there's like $5 or $10 in there, that tells me other people are doing that, that that's the correct behavior. I should be tipping as well, and I'm more likely to tip. And so by lining your tip jar with a few dollars of your own money, that increases the number of people who then tip you later on because of the principle of social proof. Back in Europe, this was in Italy. Yeah, it must be Italy. There were, when plays were being put on, this is back in like the 1800s, and plays were being put on, there were people who you could hire to sit in your audience and cheer and applaud. They're basically like hired people to make your show seem better by applauding and things like that. This is a menu card for one of these companies. So for applause on entrance, if it's a gentleman, it costs this much. And if you want insistent applause during the performance, that costs this much. And if you want interruptions with Bene or Bravo, that's this much. And so people, these theater companies would pay people to sit in the audience and pretend to like the show. And a lot of the thing is, a lot of the people in the audience, they knew these people existed. They knew they were people that were paid to cheer and clap, but it didn't matter because their mere existence led them to like the show more. Just like we know that when there's a sitcom with a laugh track, we know those people are basically being told when to laugh, right? There's like applause signs that light up that tell them when to clap and laugh and things like that. But even though we know that, we still fall prey to this. Just like the people here, even though they knew these people existed that were paid to clap, it still affected them. It still made them feel as if the show was better than it actually was. Social proof doesn't always work. It works better under some circumstances than others. So, for example, when you're uncertain as to what the correct behavior is, that's when it tends to work the most. This is the same thing when we looked at informational influence and conformity. We look to others to figure out the correct behavior when we don't know what the correct behavior is ourselves. That's what I mean when I say uncertainty. That's a general theme in social psychology that we're going to see again in this course. Furthermore, the people that we look to figure out how we should be behaving, they tend to be the people who are most similar to us. When we're trying to figure out what to do, you might look to other college age students, for example, to figure out what to do, as opposed to elderly people. Because people who are similar to us, they have the most information for us in terms of what the correct behavior is. So we tend to look to similar people. And this is effectively how person on the street ads work. So sometimes there are commercials where they'll take a film company or a film crew and they'll go out into the street and they'll stop random people on the street, or at least supposedly random people on the street. And they start interviewing them. They give them their product, like, hey, check out these sunglasses. And they try the sunglasses on. Then they ask them for their impressions. And invariably, these so-called random people on the street love the product all the time, right? Well, these ads tend to be influential if people believe these are truly random people on the street, because the people watching the ads, they don't know what the correct behavior is, if they should buy these sunglasses or not. But this person walking down the street, this could be anyone. This could be them, right? It's a random person on the street. It's similar. This person's similar to me. And it seems like everybody who stopped by this camera crew, they all love the product, right? So if I'm looking to other people to see what they're doing, and everybody loves this product, that's telling me that I should love this product. I should buy this product. But of course, this is all manipulated because they're going to edit out anyone who doesn't like the product, obviously, right? So they're making it appear as if everyone's in agreement that they like the product, even when it's not true. So they're editing it to make it look like there's this social proof because they know that influences customers. Fourth compliance principle is the principle of liking. This is a fairly simple one, which is that we're more likely to comply with people we like than people we don't like, which makes a lot of sense, right? If someone you like asks you to do something, you're more likely to do it than if someone you don't like asks you to do something. So really the question is, what determines who we like? Well, when we look at this section on attraction, we're going to explore this in more depth, but there's a couple things I want to point out right now. We tend to like people who are physically attractive. Um, This happens for a few reasons, but one of these reasons is due to something known as the halo effect. What the halo effect means is that once we think someone has one positive characteristic, we have a tendency to assume they have all sorts of other positive characteristics as well. So if we think someone is physically attractive, we have a tendency to want to think that they're also honest and generous and trustworthy and have all these other positive characteristics. And this is partly because we like the world to be very simple to think about. We like to think the world has good people and bad people. Of course, the world doesn't work that way. The world's much more nuanced, and there's people that have gray areas that do some good and some bad, but that makes things complicated for us. So when we think someone has a good quality, we want to infer that person has all sorts of other good qualities so we can put them in that category of good person, right? So when we see a physically attractive person, we have a tendency to like them more than when they're less physically attractive. And therefore, we're more influenced by physically attractive people than less physically attractive people. We also tend to like people who are similar to us. I mean, after all, as we saw before, we like ourselves a whole lot. We saw that in the section on the self. And so if you're similar to me, of course, I'm going to like you as well, right? So we like similar people. We also like things that are familiar to us in general, okay? And this is based on something known as the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect refers to this tendency whereby just being exposed to something repeatedly, the mere exposure makes you like that thing more over time. And this applies in all sorts of contexts. I've had this happen with music where I hear a song and at first I'm not sure if I like it. It's not bad, but I'm not sure. And the more I listen to it, the more I start to understand it, the more I tend to like it over time. They've done this with like if you show people like a Chinese ideograph, like a Chinese character, that they've never seen before. If you show someone a Chinese character, let's say 10 times, and you ask people to rate how much they like it, how aesthetically pleasing does it look, people will rate that character higher if they've seen it 10 times than if they've never seen it before, because the mere exposure to it makes you like that thing more. There's obviously limits to this. If you play the same song for someone 100 times in a row, they're going to end up hating it at the end, right? So there's limits, obviously. But as long as you initially are at least neutral towards something at the very beginning, if you expose them to it a few more times, they tend to like it more. That's due to the mere exposure effect. And that's true for people as well. And so just being exposed to a person multiple times can make you like them and therefore trust them more. Oh, right. So there was a study that was based on this concept, right? So think about this. If you look at yourself in the mirror, what you're seeing, the image you're seeing of yourself in the mirror is not your true image. It's not how other people see you because it's your mirror image. Everything is flipped. So if you have a freckle on your right side, it looks like it's on your left side when you look at it in the mirror, right? So let's say we gave people the option. Your option is you can choose which of these photos you like better of yourself. And I show you your true image, how you actually look to other people, or your mirror image, how you look in a mirror. Well, most of the time when you're looking at yourself, you're looking at yourself in the mirror. Not always. You might look at yourself in a picture or a video, but we probably look in mirrors a lot, right? So you're probably more familiar with your mirror image of yourself than your true image. And so if the mirror exposure effect is true, and we like things the more we're exposed to them, then if you give people the option, they should tend to prefer their mirror image compared to their true image, because that's what they see more often. But if you take those people's friends and you show them the same pictures of you, let's say, I show your friends a picture, your true image and your mirror image. Well, your friends see your true image much more often than they see your mirror image. So given the option, your friends should tend to prefer your true image. And some researchers tested this, and what they showed is that if you look at participants themselves, the majority of people prefer their mirror image compared to their true image. But if you look at those people's friends and ask them which image of this person do you like, they tend to prefer your true image compared to your mirror image, which is very much, again, consistent with the mere exposure effect. In fact, the company Tupperware made like tens and tens of millions of dollars using a really interesting business model, which capitalized on all of the four compliance principles we've discussed so far. So what they would do is they would have Tupperware parties where you would have like you yourself could host one of these Tupperware parties, and you would have a Tupperware representative come to your house. You would invite a bunch of your friends over, and then for the next few hours, you would talk to the Tupperware representative and you'd play little games and you'd talk about Tupperware. And at the very end, you're able to buy Tupperware from this person. Now, these strategies were incredibly successful at selling Tupperware because they relied on a lot of these principles. So, for example, what would happen is that you would play these little mini games and people would win prizes. The Tupperware representative would give people little prizes for winning these games. And we know from the norm of reciprocity that if you give someone something for free, they feel a need to return that favor, which they do by buying Tupperware, for example. Another thing they do is they sit around and they talk about what Tupperware they already own and the benefits of Tupperware and what they like about it. And what these people are doing are basically committing to themselves that I buy Tupperware, I use it, and I like it. And because we want to behave consistently with our past commitments, that means when later given the opportunity to buy Tupperware, those people who committed to this idea that they like it should be more likely to buy it themselves. You can also look at the principle of social proof, right? We look to others to figure out what the correct behavior is. Well, at the end of the day or end of the night, when people are able to buy Tupperware, if you're not sure if you should buy Tupperware and you look around to other people, and specifically you look around to people who are similar to you, i.e., your friends, and you see your friends buying Tupperware, that's telling you that that's the correct action. You should buy Tupperware as well. So you're more likely to buy Tupperware. And furthermore, because the person who's hosting the party, they get a cut of the profits, then what that means is you're not really buying from some nameless corporation, Tupperware. You're actually kind of, in a way, buying from your friend, right? And we like our friends. And so as a consequence, we're more likely to buy Tupperware because we like the person we're effectively buying it from. So by using all these strategies, Tupperware made just millions and millions of dollars. But there's still two more principles that we haven't talked about. The fifth compliance principle is what's known as the principle of scarcity. What this means is that things seem more valuable to us when they are less available. Now, things could be less available because they're limited in terms of how many of them there are. So if you say, there's only 10 of these items left, so you have to act now before we run out. Okay. That means that there's only 10. You've got a limited number there. Those things suddenly they feel more valuable to us when they're running out. Or it could be limited in terms of time. For a limited time only for the next week are you able to buy this product, right? In either of those cases, that feeling that you're losing the opportunity to buy that product, that makes you feel like that product is more valuable than it really is. And so what that means is that companies will often make it seem as if their product is limited, even if it's not. And there's all sorts of phrases that you will see in ads that capture this, right? So here's a few. We've got while supplies last only. Time is running out. Limited quantities. For a limited period. These are phrases you've heard hundreds and hundreds of times in ads. And they're not telling you this out of the goodness of their hearts so you don't miss an opportunity. They're telling you this so it feels as if you're losing time, you're losing the opportunity, so that makes you more likely to buy that thing. And keep in mind that these phrases mean virtually nothing. Like, while supplies last only. Well, yeah, no kidding. You can only sell a product while supplies last. If supplies don't last, you can't buy the product. So, like, obviously, while supplies last. That's not telling you that supplies are actually running out, right? But it makes you feel as if that's what they're saying. And so you're more likely to buy that product. Or limited quantities. Well, yeah, obviously, no one has an infinite number of things to sell, right? There's always limited. You might have 100 billion of them. That's still a limited quantity, right? But again, it makes you feel like there's only a few of them to go around, et cetera, et cetera. So these types of phrases make people want to buy those products even more. Very, very basic study looked at this. All they had people do, participants, was taste test chocolate chip cookies. And they tasted them either from a cookie that came from a jar that had like 10 cookies in it, or a jar that only had the one cookie in it. And then people tasted it. They rated them on a number of dimensions, including things like how tasty it was, how much they'd be willing to pay for a similar cookie, that sort of thing. And what they showed is that people would be more willing to pay for a cookie if it came from a jar that only had that one cookie versus if it came from a jar that had 10 cookies, despite the fact that all the cookies were identical. Because it felt to participants like the cookie that was in a jar of one cookie, it felt like that was scarcer. it felt to them like that cookie was more valuable, even though it wasn't, and they'd be willing to pay more for it. So people are willing to pay more money for something they believe is scarce. Now, this is familiar to something we looked at in the last lecture, in the persuasion lecture, which is known as psychological reactance. Psychological reactance, if you recall, refers to this tendency that if I tell you you can't do something, that makes you want to do it even more because you don't want to think that other people can control what you can do. And so if I tell you you don't have the freedom to do something, that makes you want to do that thing to prove that you have the ability to do it, right? And that's kind of similar to what's going on here with scarcity. If I tell you that you can buy this product, but only if you call in the next 3 minutes, I'm effectively telling you you can't have this product after 3 minutes. That should invoke this sense of psychological reactance. Like, you can't tell me what I can or can't have. I want that thing now, right? So by telling people they can't have it or something's scarce, that makes them want it more because of the principles of psychological reactance. And this works for a couple of different reasons, because scarcity oftentimes also implies social proof. Because if things are selling really quickly and there's only a few of them left, that's because other people were buying them. And if other people are buying them, then by the principle of social proof, we view that as the correct behavior and we should buy it as well. So scarcity works not only in and of itself, but also because it sort of piggybacks on the principle of social proof and applies social proof. And secondly, we have the ability to anticipate how we're going to feel if we don't buy this thing now and we decide later that we wish we did. We hate that idea of regret that we had the opportunity to do something and we missed out on that opportunity. We hate feeling that regret. And so what people will do is, to avoid any possibility of later feeling regret, they'll buy this thing now. Even if they don't need it right now, they'll buy it just so that they don't have to later feel regret if they want it in the future. So if you look at something like QVC, like the Home Shopping Network, they use a lot of these principles as well. So for instance, they'll be selling a product and there'll be like a counter that counts down how much time you have left to call to buy that product. And it starts at like 3 minutes and it ticks down. You can see it ticking down second by second, right? Now, I guarantee you, if you call 5 seconds after the timer ends, they're not going to refuse to sell you that product. Okay. That's not how it works. But by making you think that's what's happening, it makes you feel as if there's scarcity, there's limited time. And so you need to buy that product now. And the other thing that they do in this channel is they'll have a ticker that'll show you how many people have supposedly bought this product. And the ticker's always clicking up, 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 up. More people have bought it. More people have bought it. What that does is that's implying social proof. It's saying, look at how many other people are buying this product. You should buy it as well. So you can see these various principles all over the place if you're looking for them. Finally, the sixth compliance principle is that of authority. And this principle just says that we have a natural mindless tendency to just sort of obey authority figures. This happens in a lot of different contexts, but it's true even if the authority is unrelated to the request itself. So for example, some researchers who tested this, what they did is they stood by some parking spots, like metered parking at the side of the street. And whenever someone would pull in, this is their unwitting participants, and they'd get out and they'd start to rummage in their pockets for quarters to put into the machine, right? And right in front of them, there was another person in a car who was trying to go through their pockets, trying to find some quarters, but he clearly couldn't find any quarters and was struggling to he couldn't pay the parking meter for his car. Now, this person's working with the experimenter. But what happens is that as the real person is trying to put money in their meter, someone comes out from behind a building, points at that real person and says, "Hey, you there, that man, give that man a quarter to put in his meter," pointing at the person in front of him. Now, the person who says that is either dressed as a security guard or is dressed in regular clothes. And as soon as they say that, give that man a quarter, they turn around and go back behind the building. Now, what the researchers are obviously wondering here is, are people more likely to give this other person a quarter if the person who asked them was dressed as a security guard versus if they were dressed in their regular clothes? And indeed, that's exactly what happened. But why should that happen? Someone who's a security guard has no right to tell you to give someone else a quarter. That's not related to the request itself. And yet, because we have this natural tendency to want to obey authority figures, it still influences us. It still leads us to mindlessly go along and obey them. Now, this is important because people like the police know this. And so if you're pulled over, for instance, and let's say the police want to search your car, well, they can't do that without probable cause or without permission from you. So what they'll often do is say things like, "You don't mind if I search your car, do you?" And maybe you've got some illegal paraphernalia in the car. But because of your natural tendency to obey authority figures, we'll often just go along. Sure, you can search my car. We just go along with the request of the police officer. Now, you have every right to say no to them, but people often don't because of this natural tendency. And this is partly why it's really important to know what your rights are so you don't let people walk over you and abuse your rights. Now, the concept, the principle of authority is oftentimes intermixed with the social influence topic of obedience. And that's going to be the next and last social influence topic that we talk about, which is going to be in the next lecture. And for that reason, I'm going to save most of the discussion on authority for that lecture. I'll see you then.